including deciding which conferences to attend, especially now that virtual conferences have become more accessible and a lot cheaper. There may be more opportunities, and how to kind of get the most out of the conferences that we do attend. So I'm going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves, and we'll just go in alphabetical order of last name so I can call on you. And when you introduce yourself, you can give your name and your affiliation. And also we'd like you to answer a question just to get us started, which is, what is the main reason that you attend conferences? And if you have like one piece of advice that you would give to new conference goers, it would be great if you could share that with us. And this doesn't have to be specific to virtual conferences. We'll talk more about that later. But yeah, okay, so to start with John Bates.
Thanks, Teresa. So yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. My name's John Bates, and I'm a curator of birds at the Field Museum. I'm also currently the president of the Natural Science Collections Alliance. So the thing that I bring to this webinar is some experience associated with dealing with the collections community and how we've been addressing virtual meetings over the last year or so. Oh, do you want me to, so with respect to why I go to meetings? I mean, I go to meetings for the scientific content, but also for the opportunities to network with people.
Great. Ian Cost.
Hello, I'm Ian Cost. I'm a second-year professor at a small liberal arts college called Albright College in Eastern Pennsylvania. And I said it, this is my second year. I'm actually growing our bird collection, so there hasn't really been a whole lot of ology kind of things around here. And I also work in paleontology, so I've got a lot of cross-conference kinds of perspectives that hopefully I can help share and that sort of thing. I would echo the main reason is to sort of, find more science, new science, but also to talk to people that have similar interests. And that actually goes into one of the things that I always tell the undergrads that I work with when they're going to their first conferences, which is find people that are doing things that you're interested in and send them emails ahead of time so that they can schedule you in so that you have time to actually talk to them. I know I appreciate that when people want to talk to me, so I try to kind of pay that forward.
Great, yeah, thanks. That's great advice. Jim Rivers. Sorry, I got the order wrong.
That's okay. Thanks, Teresa. So I'm Jim Rivers. I'm an assistant professor of wildlife ecology at Oregon State in the College of Forestry, and I've been attending AOS meetings for longer than I care to admit. It was a different society back then. It was the AOU when I first started going. And the reason I attend conferences are the same kind of ideas that have already been put out there. I think it's important to share the work that we do. I always hear that we don't really do science until it's published. And I think part of that process is also communicating it as it's in process as well. So I think it's good to get feedback on ongoing projects, particularly from talks. I learn a lot from the meeting. I'm in the College of Forestry, and there's just a couple of folks here who do bird work. So when I get to the meeting, it's all birds, and so it's really a source of inspiration and thinking about maybe I could try that in my system, or just thinking more about the theory. And then of course there's a big part of catching up with old friends, lab mates, people you've worked with before, and that socializing piece, which I think is really a big value. In terms of advice for new attendees, I'd actually say there's a couple of things. One, I think, is to set your own goals for the meeting, and whether that's to track down somebody that you might be interested in working with, or getting speaking experience if you want to give a talk or a poster. I think you need to be prepared to talk a little bit about yourself and what you do, and not just kind of say, well, I'm looking for grad school, but say, what your interests are and what they encompass. But I think the most important thing is to schedule some downtime. I remember being a young student and thinking that I should go to every talk and doing that. And by the end of the 3 or 4 days was just totally wiped out. And so it's okay not to go to talks. It's okay to stay in the hallway and talk with folks and learn more about birds and the society and things like that. In fact, some of those conversations in the hallways are career-wise are much better than the presentations that you get in terms of your benefit. So that's something that I usually give counsel to new grad students or undergrads when they're going to a meeting.
Great, thanks. And yeah, it's interesting to think about how to replicate those experiences in a virtual setting, but we can talk about that in a moment. Yeah, Jeanne Fair, I'm sorry I skipped over you in the alphabetical order.
No, that's okay. So I'm Jeanne Fair. I'm a scientist at Los Alamos National Laboratory. So I have sort of the government and academic perspective. My first conference was an AOU. Actually, the first one was the Coopers, and then right after was AOU, and that was back in 1990. And I just fell in love with them right there. So the reason to go to conferences is to not just highlight your own stuff and get feedback, but I second what Jim says with being immersed in birds. A lot of my job is not necessarily birds. And so it's my one time that I get to just sit and talk and listen to a talk about mountain chickadees and just love every minute of it. But the real reason to go is to connect with other researchers and other students and other scientists. Part of my job actually for the last 7 or so years has been to travel to international conferences around the world and actually connect up scientists. And so not necessarily in the bird world, more in infectious disease, but how do you connect and make those connections? And that's all done outside of a session. It's all done at beers afterwards and dinners and in the hallway. And so, yeah, that is really hard to replicate. We're trying in the virtual world, and we'll all be happy when maybe we can have a hybrid, when you can get more people come to conferences, because you can, like AOU this year, AOS, it was $50. And so it was the biggest meeting ever. And so that's one of the pros. But basically, it's still about meeting those people and connecting.
Great, thanks. All right, Jenny, do you want to go next?
Sure, yeah. So I'm Jenny Euling. I'm a fifth-year PhD student at Cornell. And so I've been to a number of conferences at this point, and I feel like I've learned a lot as I've gone along. The main reason I go to conferences are many of the reasons already mentioned. I think another big benefit is that you're able to learn about research going on sometimes before it's published. And so you're able to get a sense of like what directions certain labs are going in or certain researchers are going in, and it can lead to conversations about collaborations before you even know, from literature published that a researcher might be working on something. And then I think one piece of advice I would give is that you shouldn't be nervous to talk to people you don't know, even to kind of walk up to somebody and just, introduce yourself. I think the first couple of times I went to conferences, I was really terrified. And like during social events, I would just find the people that I knew and only talk to them and not really try and branch out of my comfort zone. But I think as I've gone along, I've gotten a little bit better at talking to people I don't know. And that's been really helpful in just, getting my name out there, and also learning about really cool research and just chatting about science and different ideas. So, yeah.
Great. All right, and finally, Jessie.
Hi, I'm Jessie Williamson. I am also a fifth-year PhD student at the University of New Mexico Museum of Southwestern Biology. And I attended my very first conference in 2016 at NAOC in Washington, DC, and it was very overwhelming because there were thousands of people there, and I felt like I did not navigate it very well. And since then, I think I've gotten a little bit better at it. So I would say, in line with most of, pretty much recapping on what everyone said, I think it's really important to go to conferences for 3 reasons. One is to meet people in our field, especially if you're interested in collaborating with somebody or working with somebody in the future. The second reason is to learn about research happening. And as Jenny just mentioned, most of it's unpublished, and that's really exciting. And the third is to share my research or our research. I think going to conferences and giving talks is a really great way to self-promote. And you can actually invite people to your talk that you might want to work for as a way to kind of sell yourself in a sort of pre-job informal setting, which is helpful. And in that vein, I think conferences can be really overwhelming. And as Jim mentioned, there's a lot of pressure to attend all the talks and go to all the sessions, but inevitably there's one or two sessions that you're not quite as interested in. And I would say, don't be afraid to take advantage of giving yourself free time and taking breaks, like take a walk outside, go have coffee with a friend. Sometimes it's nice to talk with somebody you know after you spend so much time talking with people you don't know. For introverts, it can be particularly challenging. So just give yourself a break. And I think that means that you'll be able to take better advantage of talks that you're going to, and you'll have way more fun.
All right, that was a lot of really great advice about conferences in general. Thank you, everyone. So now that we've introduced our panel, the next part, which is basically going to be the rest of the webinar, is we'll go over questions from the audience and some moderation questions. So we'll start out with a couple of questions we got from the pre-registration form, but I would like to encourage everyone in the audience to, if you have a question, you can either put it in the chat or you can use your microphone. And if you want to use the microphone, you can use the little raise hand button or wait for a moment of silence to ask your question, just so that it doesn't get too hectic. But yeah, so again, we'll start out with the pre-submitted questions. So this first question, I think, is a really great sort of overview of the conference situation that we have now, which is, what would you say are some of the pros and cons of virtual versus in-person conferences? And sorry, I'll also just say any of the panelists who want can give a thought on this, and we don't have to have a specific order, so just go for it.
Well, I can start out. I mean, in the introductions, people have already done a good job of talking about some of the differences, right? You've got the opportunity to go back and listen to things that are recorded. And one of the amazing things to me, I was on the student awards committee for AOS this past time, and the great thing was I could go back and the slides were there and you could see everything really well. So there are some really great advantages. One thing I will say though is I suspect, from the perspective of meeting organization, that we are going to see fewer hybrids down the road than people really think, in part because it's a lot more work to try to put on those kinds of things. And it seems like it may actually be something that's fairly expensive to do. In other words, if you've got to engage a group of people to help you get the virtual stuff on, you've also got to engage people to get the in-person stuff on. So it'll be interesting to see what happens.
I think with these virtual conferences, it's much easier to schedule that downtime that Jim mentioned. As a grad student, I was told a couple of times by a couple of different people that downtime was not something I should have, that I should be always networking and always on, except when I'm asleep. And that's not a good thing to do, especially for somebody as introverted as I am normally, which is why the scheduling works really well for me, because then I know I have to be, vocal and on. So having the downtime of being able to get up and walk away from my computer and then resume a talk in the middle of the virtual conference has been really nice. Obviously, it probably won't stay forever, but it has been a really nice thing for my introverted self.
Another big pro to the virtual format is that for students, it's very affordable compared to the cost of attending, any conference anywhere. It's very hard to keep that affordable between either plane flights or car, lodging, even when splitting with people, food. You can only cut so many corners to get the cost down. And so it's really hard to beat that. In an odd way, I actually think there's a chance to meet more people in a virtual setting. And I was really impressed with the way the NAOC organizers from last summer put together the Slack channels and groups and then facilitated interactions among people. And it was actually very heartening to see so many people creating new groups and branching out to start like trivia games or meetups. We had a really nice museum ornithology meetup. Actually, I would think it was just museums more broadly. And it was very fun to get to meet collections managers and curators I'd never spoken with before. So in that way, you know, you can meet 30 people in an hour, whereas at a face-to-face conference that might be harder to orchestrate. But also I miss the social interactions of meeting people in person. And it's really hard to gauge personalities and kind of how you jive with somebody when you're doing it online. So there's a little something lost, but I think there's also something gained in the virtual format.
I think also from the student perspective, I remember when I was a first and second year grad student, I was still getting my projects together and, you know, didn't really have a lot to share at conferences yet, but funding from Cornell and, you know, and yeah, I think maybe from AOS as well for attendance at the conference, like you had to be presenting something, whether it was a poster or a talk. And so I remember like trying to put something together and feeling like it wasn't that great because I didn't have all of my data yet and it was preliminary. And I think that, you know, the ability to attend a conference maybe without giving a talk or without giving a poster and just sit there and take everything in, especially as an early stage grad student, is really invaluable. And so I think that's another benefit of virtual conferences is that those costs to attend aren't nearly anywhere near as high as they normally would be. And so you can really take advantage of just kind of taking things in and not spending a lot of time stressing over preliminary results.
I would agree with that, Jenny. And you don't have to sleep on some floor of some hotel with full students too. So we all did that as students. And, you know, going back to also what you said earlier, Jenny, I'd agree with not being afraid to going up to somebody and talking to them, because it literally may be your 35th AOS meeting. And you may have lots of friends there, but you know, there's these moments where you're like, oh God, thank goodness somebody's talking to me. You know, you're just so grateful that, especially as students, you know, that, yeah, you know, like, oh, they know who I am, or maybe they don't. And it's just awesome to share your experiences and ask about students. So no matter what age, I think that, yeah, not being afraid to talk to somebody, because in a conference setting, you know, different than a grocery store, everybody's sort of like looking for interaction. So yeah, I agree with that.
I don't know about the rest of the panel, but when I go to a meeting, it's a good excuse to stay off my computer and not be checking email. And in fact, about 1.5 years, I took email off my phone and I haven't regretted it one bit. So what I find with virtual conferences is I get really distracted because I'm watching someone talk, but then there's something else on my screen that might be of interest or an email pops up. Whereas when I'm sitting in that session, my computer's not with me and I'm just sitting there kind of focused and taking notes. So I think that's one, for me at least, that's one of the downsides. I know some people love that because they're doing two things at once. So I guess that's the one thing that I really miss and have missed over the last year with virtual conferences, is that ability to just kind of shut off one aspect. And Jeanne put it nicely, you know, it's like the one day I get to geek out on birds and just be there and be really focused on it. So that's one thing that I miss. I guess the other thing that I also wonder about, and I don't know if this is true or not, but we have a lot of folks who go to the AOS who are older members of the society, and not all of them are technologically savvy. They may not really understand what a Slack channel is and that sort of thing. So I think there's those sorts of interactions get kind of removed from that online setting. You have to be pretty savvy to know how to use some of the apps and kind of keep things going. So there's certainly benefits in costs and benefits of both approaches. As John noted, I'm hoping that we can do some hybrid, but I think it's going to be pretty challenging to do that effectively for the long term, at least.
I'd add to that, Jim, in that when you're speaking in a conference in a live audience, there's feedback, right? And so if you have a little joke, they'll laugh. And so I've been struggling with it. If I'm giving a seminar and everybody sort of has their cameras off to save bandwidth or whatever, you know, sometimes I'm like, is it still on? Like, are they still there? I mean, it's really hard that way. So that interaction with a live audience is important. And so I don't know, I've had my dog sometimes be in the room, so I don't feel like I'm quite alone, even though there may be 70 people on the line, like, but you don't know, they're just sort of names. But sometimes I really wonder if my connection, my internet didn't crash, but then I'm like, and then somebody will be like, oh, great, give me the thumbs up. I'm like, okay. So yeah, that's a little bit harder.
So one of the other audience submitted questions touches on another one of the cons of virtual conferences, which is this Zoom fatigue that everybody is now familiar with after this year. So the question says that the person always struggles with watching live sessions of conference presentations, mostly due to Zoom fatigue, but they also feel guilty about not watching a session live. So they were interested if there are any tips for students to help them navigate what to focus on and how to avoid Zoom fatigue at virtual conferences.
I don't have advice.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, I don't have advice for Zoom fatigue, but I would tell that person not to feel guilty, because if they can watch it at a time that's going to help them get more out of it, then, you know, by all means do that. And the person who's giving the presentation, as Jeanne said, you don't really know who's there. You see some people in the background. Same as with teaching. I was talking about this today, a class of 45, 50 students, and just, you know, not even sure if they were there. You want to kind of tap on the screen and ask them. So I think that it works differently for everyone and how we learn and how we get information. So I would say, don't feel guilty if you don't watch something live. It seems totally fine to me.
Yeah, I was going to say, you know, think about how, you know, put yourself in the place of the speaker with respect to trying to think about engagement. In other words, if they're taking the time to give that talk and you can think of some questions to ask, take advantage of asking those questions, because that'll sort of keep you engaged and get you a little beyond the Zoom fatigue. But then the other thing I was thinking about is I wanted to emphasize is just remember that, you know, the chat can only take you so far with respect to communicating with someone. And so feel free to reach out to people afterwards if there's some question that you have, because people will respond. And that was something that I thought was really interesting at the NAOC that happened more so than I would have thought in previous meetings, you know, where I guess, you know, what happens is somebody tracks you down in person, but you know, take advantage of it, email people, you know, they'll respond.
Yeah, I would second what Ian said earlier too. I mean, first, don't feel guilty, whether you're going back to your hotel room to take a nap or not watching it live. I think what Ian said, knowing that he's an introvert, you know, I'm exactly 50-50. So if you ever do the test, if you're an introvert versus an extrovert, you should totally do it. There's several online. It turns out I'm 50-50. So that means that I will be right in that conference having a great time. And then all of a sudden I'll be like, I need to get out of here and go to the bathroom or go to my hotel room. So, you know, knowing what you are is totally fine. And then you recharge and go back in, but being kind to yourself and don't feel guilty.
As far as what to focus on to avoid Zoom fatigue, I kind of think of myself as a generalist. And so for better or worse, that means I'm interested in too many things all the time. And that can be overwhelming. So I try to just kind of pick and choose. So sometimes there's one session, say it's all about, you know, ecology or evolution. Maybe I'll geek out in that entire session and then I need a break because I've just done a long stint on Zoom. Maybe what I want to do is bounce between rooms because one's physiology oriented, one's ecology oriented, and one's more evolutionary. And I want to be able to dabble in different topics. And that's kind of exciting because you can mix it up and you don't always feel like you're drilling down in the same thing at once. Sometimes I want to follow somebody's work that I've been following for a while. So I might not actually be that interested in the talk, but I want to keep up with a researcher I really admire. And that's a good way to also kind of like mix it up thematically. I was going to say something else. I forgot. Must not be important. But anyways, taking breaks in between that, obviously not to keep beating this point, but I think that's very important. And just like taking a moment to enjoy the process. It doesn't always have to be painful. It can actually be better to watch talks, I think, after they've finished, because you have the ability to pause and take notes. And I'm kind of a slow note taker, but I want to be able to remember things that are important. So that flexibility is nice sometimes.
Yeah, I think with that, whether it's a Zoom meeting or in person, sometimes, that fatigue is real for both. Sometimes I've made it a game. And by making it a game, I might have a challenge to myself that day. Like at the cocktail hour, I'm going to meet 3 new people, or I'm going to go to a talk today that I would never normally go to, that has nothing to do with ever, to learn something new. And so I'll sort of have these little gamify my conferences a little bit with a few extra little things to kind of spice it up so that I meet new people and learn new things, or maybe go to a meeting that I normally wouldn't go to sort of challenge myself and then, like make it fun.
I guess one other benefit, and this may just be the way that I approach live versus recorded, but I feel like if I, and this is true of like in-person conferences too, I feel like if I sit in on a presentation that's happening live, or like obviously if it's happening in person, once I'm there, I don't want to leave because I feel guilty about leaving. But sometimes there might be a talk where you read the title and it seems like it's going to be super relevant to your work, and then you actually go down and like sit down and start listening to the talk, and you realize that it's not relevant at all, and it's like so over your head. And so I think one of the benefits of watching talks afterwards is that if it turns out that a talk is not really relevant to your interests, you can just leave and no one will notice and nothing will happen. So yeah, I think that's one benefit of watching them recorded.
Just don't sit in the center, sit on the side by the aisles, get out easier. You always have an exit plan.
Well, another pro of the virtual format is that I think you can actually watch more talks than you would be able to at an in-person conference, because of the 2 things that Jenny and Jeanne just mentioned, where, normally at a face-to-face conference, you're rushing to get to a room, you're trying to find a seat at the very edge, or you're awkwardly crowded in the back because you know that as soon as it finishes, you're dashing off to the next room. And in the virtual format, you just exit, click, enter, watch.
So it looks like we have a great question in the chat, which is, how do people choose which conferences to go to in a year? I think that's also especially relevant now because we can go to more than we did before because of the price and logistics. And then also, how many conferences is too many, and what about skipping years?
So there are a couple of questions there. One thing I was going to mention again is the value of going to smaller conferences in addition to big ones, especially if it's your first conference. I think one of the best things you can do, and you'll find this later on in your career too, is that smaller conferences, everybody's more laid back, they're under less pressure, and it's often easier to talk to people at smaller conferences than it is to larger conferences. And I actually think that's true in a virtual framework as much as it is in a non-virtual framework. So with respect to what conferences to go to, I mean, this is one of the things I think which is a really beautiful aspect of the virtual setting. So, with the world of collection digitization and stuff that's out there, there's absolutely no way I can keep track of everything that's going on. But I can hear from other people about talks that they thought that were really good, that they heard at other meetings, that I've been able to go track down and listen to, that's been really valuable. And that's something that, of course, you couldn't have done in a real situation. So I think the real opportunity is to just sort of pick and choose. And at the same time, I'd say there's no doubt about getting meeting fatigue is a reality, and you can't go to all the meetings that you potentially like to out there. There's just not enough hours in the day.
I have all my undergrads go to like state level conferences first, like the Pennsylvania Academy of Sciences or something like that, because it's kind of small and it's hugely interdisciplinary. And then the first one that I'll have them go to that's kind of international is the Society for Integrative and Comparative Biologists. And that's because they can go to a talk on crabs or fish or birds or whatever they want. But it has that small conference feel to it because there are so many little societies that make up the bigger society. And so it's a really nice gateway. I don't like taking them to things like the Society for Vertebrate Paleontology. I'll go to that by myself because that's all people, all dinosaurs all day long for like a week. And it's huge and expensive and it takes a lot of energy out of you. And that's not, that's not good for undergrads. But that leads into the other part of the question. I've skipped the SVP conference, the Vertebrate Paleontology conference, for like 3 years now because I talked about some dinosaurs and now I'm not working on them right this second. So I don't bother going. And it's fine if you need to skip one here and there or a couple of years in a row or whatever. Nobody's going to get mad. I don't think, at least, anybody's going to get mad. They might miss you and be really excited when you're back, but I don't think anybody would get upset that you skipped any years or anything like that.
Yeah, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say one thing that just occurred to me as Ian was speaking is that some conferences, in addition to like the big, large, or the small to large size scale, some conferences I think are more student friendly than others. I can't say I've been to one that's distinctly not student friendly yet, but one that I've been told by colleagues is very student friendly is the SOCNIS conference put on by the Society for Advancing Chicanos, Hispanics, and Native Americans in Science. And there are a ton of activities aimed towards getting students to network, supporting students, even I think like giving students feedback before they present at the conference. And that's a really, really good way for people to meet potential advisors and learn about grad school opportunities. So some conferences try to put forward more student activities. The AOS student mentor meetups have been really beneficial. So I would definitely encourage anyone at the student level to attend those. I think it's a really good way to meet peers and potential collaborators, mentors, advisors of any kind, or even just people to talk to the next time you go to a conference, which is always nice to know somebody.
One thing that would go into my factoring of how many conferences to go to is a general workload and how that might be seasonal or not. As you've heard, it's a lot of energy and it's a lot of cost, at least for in-person conferences to go to. And if you're coming up on a deadline, whether it's for your thesis or your dissertation or something, and you're gone for a week, that's a week that you spent not working on things and you're digging out from being gone, probably. So those can become pretty big. I don't want to say time sinks, but may not be the best use of your time in that particular moment. And I can remember years ago the ISBE meeting was held at Cornell, and then the AOU meeting was a joint meeting with Cooper. I think it was in Portland, and it was back to back. So with my lab, we went to Cornell, stayed there for 4 or 5 days, and then got on a plane and went to Portland for the same thing. And it was, it took us probably 2 weeks to get back on track from being gone for that long. So I think that's a consideration to think about how many conferences to go to. But it's obviously a personal choice. And if you are one of those people who thrives off of the interaction, it's great. But I think, like many of the folks who've already mentioned this, a lot of us are introverts. We're scientists. I think that goes hand in hand with being a scientist sometimes. So there's a lot of energy expended to go into conferences and being on.
Yeah, I'd be interested in people's thoughts on this. I mean, the other thing about the fact that things are digital these days and you could go to more is you can potentially give a second talk on the research that you've done for a completely different set of people. And traditionally that's been something that's somewhat frowned upon that you should do a new talk every time. But from my perspective, if you're talking to a different set of people, they haven't heard what you've done. And so picking and choosing, you know, in those situations can give you, you know, the opportunity to be exposed to a whole bunch of different people that you wouldn't see otherwise.
One thing that I wanted to mention that I don't think anyone has said yet is that I found it really helpful to go to conferences that my advisor is going to, because then she can introduce me to people that I might, you know, not like be confident enough to introduce myself to, or even people that I might not even realize could be really good collaborators or just contacts to have. So she does go to SCO-SOC, which is a great conference. And so I've gone to SCO-SOC for a couple of years, just partially because of that. Like, it's just nice to be in a situation where you can get those introductions easily. And then one thing I don't think anyone mentioned, but that I think is worth just thinking about is when conferences are in person, I think it's totally fine to choose places that you actually want to visit, either because, you know, you have friends in the area, or, you know, you want to go backpacking afterwards somewhere. That's like not the primary way I choose conferences, but I think it's fine to be like think about possibilities there as well. Yeah.
Jeanne, I got excited about your question in the chat about favorite conferences that we've attended. And actually the first one that comes to mind, in addition to several excellent AOS meetings, was a very small conference called the Evolutionary Genomics of Adaptation Symposium. So it was put together by a kind of a small-ish working group between a few universities. And it was held at Flathead Lake Biological Station in Montana. So my lab mate and I drove up to Montana. So it was a really good excuse to take a road trip through a part of the West we'd never been to. We did some great camping on the way up, and then that made it cheap too. We got up there and everybody stayed in the cabins at the biological station. And I want to say there couldn't have been more than like 60 to 80 people total. So it was very small. It was very informal. There was amazing research that felt so intimidating to me at the time because I was in my second year of grad school. I hadn't even begun doing anything that anyone presented about that I still need to get sequence data for. So I'm still not quite there yet. But it was really inspirational to be around such a small kind of like intimate group and then have the pressure of social interactions removed, because you're drinking a bubbly water on a patio overlooking the lake and it's beautiful in the sun setting and everyone's excited and birding and talking, and you know, there are mammal people and insect people, and it was just cool. It was a cool setting, a really nice group of people. It was very small, and you know, you're on your way to the dining hall in the morning to eat breakfast, and you can bump into someone and be like, "Hey, how's the oatmeal? I loved your talk." And that was really cool.
Nice.
Yeah, what are some other favorite conferences people have been to? I'm partly curious about this because I have mainly really only gone to AOS conferences, and obviously, you know, that's kind of why we're here, but there are a bunch of other societies, and I'm curious which ones people have attended and what they've liked about them.
So I put this digital data conference into the chat, and this is something that's run every year by iDigBio, and it's capped at about, I think it's 200 people now, and they've held it in person at various small universities, and then last year they held it digitally, and it's going to be digitally in June this year. But it's small, and it's focused on digitization of museum collections and how those data can actually be used. And so again, you can look out depending on what you're interested in for specific things, and there's a topic that you won't see covered across the spectrum of biodiversity very well outside of a symposium, maybe at a larger meeting. And so it's just a really great opportunity to have a whole bunch of people in the room that are really deeply immersed in a specific topic. And I think those kinds of things can be, like Jesse was saying earlier, can be really great if you've got a specific topic like that, that's a small meeting you can go to.
I don't know if anybody, did anybody go to the NAOC that was in New Orleans when Hurricane Catherine hit it? that was my favorite. It had really nothing to do with the conference other than Hurricane Catherine came in, and then we were sequestered. We weren't allowed to leave the hotel. Well, we actually managed to survive, but we weren't able to leave. So it was the best attended poster session ever, which meant that it was like wall to wall. You couldn't get through the little aisles. And then after the hurricane came and went, and we waded through all of the water, and just, it was crazy. We rented out the House of Blues, and it was, the House of Blues was only filled with ornithologists. So sometimes you don't know it's going to be your favorite.
I think my favorite meeting was actually an AOS meeting that our lab hosted in Santa Barbara back in, I think it was 2005. And it was fun because we were involved with, back then we didn't have conference services that was in charge of the meeting. And so it was really the local community did a lot of that. And so that meant that a lot of our lab was doing things. And so we had fun that whole week, but the best part was we got to, and this was just as a student affairs committee was getting going. And we had, it was supposed to be a student only event, but a lot of non-students found their way to it. But we had a beach bonfire at the end of the conference after the final night. And we had a couple of friends who were fire dancers who came down and did a fire dance, and it went over quite well. So that was one of my favorites. But I bring that up because a lot of us have talked about, or at least we're kind of giving advice for folks who might be a little intimidated about going to a meeting. And one of the things that I found really helpful, and I found it helpful in that Santa Barbara meeting, was to be involved with tasks that are going on at the meeting. And so the Student Affairs Committee is a great example of getting involved and having that network of people that you're working with, and you're at the meeting and get to know them. And there's lots of committees that want to have students on them and are looking for student involvement. So if you get to a meeting, sometimes that's the best way to start kind of connecting with people, as well as through the work of the meeting proper.
Yeah, that's great advice, and those have all been really great stories. Makes me look forward to going back to in-person or hybrid conferences eventually. But
just on that note, in thinking about favorite conferences, I think one thing that stood out, and I just realized it now, is that it was the conferences where there was a group of us that went together. I may go to a conference alone, and that's great, and I'll have a fine time, but like, it's the ones where you get like your bunch of lab mates, or you have a bunch of grad students or some peers, like you get like this sort of momentum of a little group from your university or your area, you go together. And that means you have so many more opportunities outside the conference to go to dinner or whatever. And those are, I think, now that I realize it, really important to do. And I'd say give advice to do that.
Yeah, that's definitely a great idea, especially for in-person conferences and maybe for virtual ones too. If you have a group Slack channel, that could be really great. I guess on that theme, so we only have a few minutes left, but I would really curious to hear from the panelists whether you have been involved in any networking or social activities associated with any virtual conferences and how those went. I think maybe some people might be people who aren't familiar with conferences or virtual conferences might be wondering whether it's worth it to do those or if they're awkward or things like that. So I'm really curious how those things have gone for you all, if you've done any.
So I was surprised at NAOC. Jeanne, I think I went to that collections thing, and that was the one where they randomly sent people off to chat rooms and then had them come back for a little while. And I remember thinking, this will never work. And it was actually kind of fun at the end of the evening to just be put into a room with a whole bunch of people you didn't know, but who were interested in collections, and you could talk to them. So I think there's some strategies that can work, although I think it's always harder than doing things at the House of Blues.
I did one of those rooms, and it was kind of an impromptu discussion of brood parasitism, and it went. I didn't know what to expect, but it went pretty well. I think part of it was because Mark Hauber was there as an MC, and if you know Mark, you know that he's very good at kind of keeping a whole group going, and then also kind of connecting everyone. So a lot of it probably depends on who's doing it. But as John said, I was surprised. I kind of went in saying, oh, I'm not even sure this is going to work, and then said, wow, that's actually pretty good. I got something out of it. It was worth the time.
I think any Zoom networking that occurs with smaller groups of people is always better than larger groups. I attended a social event at NAOC that was a subset of folks that had been involved in the symposium that I was part of, and there were like 15 people on the screen at once, and I found that really challenging because it seemed like some of them already knew each other, and so it was hard for me to enter the conversation, and so I ended up just leaving. But yeah, I think any opportunity to interact with smaller groups, and yeah, I think someone's saying like a moderator is also awesome.
So I have a question for everybody on this. Do you think it's harder to cold email somebody after their talk to ask them a question, or to go up to somebody in person? Because one of the things that I would also do to sort of gamify it is, you know, I might look at the program and be like, oh, these 10 people, oh my gosh, if I could just meet 2. And so I'd be like, okay, my goal is I have to go up to 2 of these people. You know, they might have been really well known at that time. And so I would sort of force myself to do that. But, you know, in the Zoom, I don't really know how to do that. You know, I could like send a cold email and say, oh, I liked your talk. And then they write back, thanks. I mean, so that's a hard one. I don't know.
For me, it's kind of hands down going up to people afterwards and trying to talk to them, which I think honestly has made it a little easier for me to be on the other end of that, because I know how hard that is. But emails, you know, it's so less personal that it feels super easy to just be like, hello, doctor, or whatever, or hello, whoever, if it's a student, and just fire off an email. I feel like that's so much easier, because it's not, you know, I don't have to be on. I can make drafts of it and I can work on it for 5 minutes or whatever. I don't just have to walk up and be like, hi, I'm not a spaz, pay attention to me, right? Which is how I feel when I'm trying to get my point across talking. Yeah.
It's funny because I feel the opposite. It feels like if I'm going up to someone after their talk, I have a very clear line to them and like, hey, I saw you talk about this, I didn't understand it, or have you looked at this? And in a regular conference, oftentimes you don't get that opportunity to do that right at that moment because you're off to another session or something. So being able to do that at one of the social events, or you have some downtime and you see that person sitting there, say, hey, I saw your talk, really liked it. So it's funny, I kind of have the different perspective on that from you, Ian.
Although I have been saying to some of the new people I've been meeting on Zoom or working with this last year, I have been saying, okay, the next time we meet in person at AOS, let's have a beer together. So I've already got like a list of people to have beers with. I've got the running beer list, so including everyone on this. So if we ever all meet together at an in-person at AOS, come grab me and we'll go enjoy a coffee in the morning or a beer.
Oh, Roy, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing your name right. I think you might be trying to ask a question, but I can't hear anything.
Is that any better?
That's better, yeah, perfect.
Okay. I'm a student. I haven't been to a lot of in-person biological conferences, but I have been to other conferences. But especially being a student, I find that I miss a lot online, because when I'm talking to somebody face to face, like a professor or somebody in the field, my mind is working as I'm talking to them. And so I'm able to ask them questions like on the fly. Like if they tell me something and I think about it for a moment, I'm able to just go right back and ask them a question about it. Whereas I can't really do that online or after a conference. I just feel like the way that I interact with people, if I were to write them an email about every question, I'd be like bombarding their email. But if I'm having a conversation and there's a dialogue that I'm going back and forth with somebody on, then I get all of the information right then and there. And it takes like 5 minutes. You know, if I'm doing it virtually, it could be days sometimes, you know, with the communication. So I really like the whole in-person part. I feel like it's really challenging. Like, there's definitely been some advantages to it, but for me, the disadvantages far outweigh the advantages for, you know, online and virtual communication.
Yeah, that's a good point. I wonder whether I'm not sure of all the details of how this summer's AOS conference is going to go, but I wonder whether there can be ways to replicate that ability to just like have a 5-minute conversation with somebody. Like, I don't know if there are like Zoom rooms that are always available and you could be like, hey, I have a question about your talk. Could you meet me for 5 minutes in, you know, Zoom room 3 or something like that? That would be interesting. Yeah, any other final thoughts or questions? This has been a really interesting conversation. Thank you everyone for being here.
I have 2 final thoughts. The first that we've all kind of danced around but haven't directly mentioned is getting enough sleep. And so I think going hand in hand with the taking breaks when you need it. Don't be afraid to turn down something like a social interaction happening late at night. You know, people are going out to grab a beer or late night coffee or whatever. Don't be afraid to say no to that because you might need 8 hours of sleep at least one night. I think that's totally fine. And then the second thing is that I think the first conference you go to is the most intimidating. And then after that, you slowly don't realize how your network is building up. And you start building a student network, which is really cool and something I didn't anticipate when I started grad school, that you get to know students at your same level or, you know, just above you or below you from all across the country, all over the world. And it's fun to say hi to friends when you start going to conferences again. So I think the first one's hardest, and after that, it gets easier.
It also gets easier to prioritize sleep as you get older. So don't worry about that.
Maybe to go along with what Jesse said and what others have said is that we've all been there at that first conference, and those of us who've stayed with it probably had a good experience. I think nowadays there's a lot of thought that goes into conferences to providing new members, whether they're students or not, with kind of an introduction to the society and lots of opportunities for that. So those are meant to make people feel welcome, and hopefully that makes people feel welcome. And if you're not, then I think something is off. And I think you should feel comfortable talking to the people who are in the local planning committee or the student affairs committee and just say, hey, something seems a little bit off. Those of us who are older and longer in the tooth, we have to have folks who are coming in behind us who continue this on. I feel really lucky that part of my job is to actually go to these conferences where there's lots of fun people, lots of smart people who do really cool stuff, and you can kind of just sit back and listen and take it all in. So in some ways it's a lot of work. It's very expensive. They're hard to attend sometimes, but it's a great perk of being in science. So I feel really fortunate to be able to do it.
All right, well, oh, sorry, I saw some microphones go off. Go ahead, if people have more things to say. Okay, well, sorry.
Go ahead, Teresa. No, go ahead. No, go ahead.
I just want to say, before everyone leaves and before we stop the recording, to just put it out there, a reminder about our next event, which is going to be perfect. Jeanne has placed it in the chat. It's going to be specifically about giving a talk at a virtual conference, interacting with your invisible audience. We've also kind of touched on that a little bit too. It's really hard when maybe your dog is the only one you have to see in the audience. And hopefully this will be a really great event for tips on that kind of thing. It's not going to be until the end of July, so we're taking a bit of a break for June, but definitely keep it in mind.